Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of How Did We Not Know That? My name's Jack.
And I'm Nat.
And today, Nat is going to present a topic of her choosing.
Yeah, today I'm going to be talking about the Native American civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s.
Okay, do tell.
So, yeah, actually, I'm super excited to talk about this. I feel like I really did not know anything about this movement. So, yeah, I have a lot to talk about. I'm going to talk about quite a few different demonstrations and activist groups. And so, before I get into all that, I kind of want to set the stage as to what the US looked like during the 1960s. So, basically, during this time, we see a huge surge in social activism and many different civil rights movements. The most notable one is the African American civil rights movement. And so the Civil Rights Act is actually passed in 1964, as we all know. And that was a huge landmark for minorities in the US. Um, and so with this in mind, we also see a lot of social activism in regards to Native American rights in the US. And so
Okay, before you go, I have a question. So, with the Native American Civil Rights Act, how did it look for Native Americans in the country during the 1960s? Because we see like segregation between blacks and whites, but I actually don't know what that looked like for Asians or Hispanics or Native Americans. So, did you do like research on that?
yeah, so this is actually just like the General Civil Rights Act in 1964 that was passed in regards to segregation in general. But so Native Americans at this time, I would say a lot of the main concerns on in regards to their protests is about land claim and life on the reservations and treaties that had been ignored by the US. And so a lot of it has a more legal focus um, compared to other minority groups. And so, yeah. It's just a lot of land claim rights, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Yeah, and so Native Americans were also facing a lot of racism, and we see harassment from police and profiling as well at this time too. Um, and struggles between, you know, encouragement of Native Americans to assimilate to standard American white culture. And
Mm-hmm.
at this time, there's mostly a lot of anger about um, reclaiming land that had been stolen in the past. So we also see protests against the holiday of Columbus Day. A lot of people are to this day are still very angry that it is a US holiday.
Oh, wow. They were protesting that in the 60s.
Yeah, it's been going.
Dude, I got taught about Columbus Day like as a good thing when I was in second grade. And it was already controversial.
Yeah, no, I was really surprised to see that too. I also thought it was like a more recent issue, but no, this has been literally being protested against since the 60s. But yeah, so we see protests against that holiday, and then we also see a lot of lobbying of history textbook companies to include more respectful accounts of Native American culture and history. And so obviously this is an episode of How Did We Not Know That? So I still think there's a lot of progress that needs to be made in regards to the American education system and how it teaches Native American history. But I mean, compared to how it was in the 1960s, I think there has been significant changes that have been made.
Right. Especially with like the internet. I think now you can actually like hear the other side's opinions instead of just getting a textbook and having to rely on that.
Exactly. I think that's the most important way to understand how Native American, what the contemporary situation is like, and then also its history is from Native Americans and indigenous peoples directly. So yay, internet. And then so I guess to go into a little bit more about the movement, we also see organized fish-ins where Native Americans would fish in rivers that white residents wanted exclusively for themselves. And so these were more like peaceful demonstrations, also like fighting for their land claims. And in 1961, so 500 Indian leaders from all across the country meet in Chicago to form the National Indian Youth Council. And so as a result, the organization begins to petition the federal government to address hundreds of Indian treaties that the government had broken over the last 400 years. And so, like, I guess this is one of the, what's the word for it? Like, this is one of the more like notable features of the movement at this time, is that we start seeing groups. There had always been activists and people who wanted to make a change, but now we see more organized groups coming together to make substantial legislative change. And so, for example, when the federal government wanted to build a dam on Seneca land, the Native Americans cited treaties that had been signed during George Washington's administration saying that the US wouldn't build on Seneca land. And so that project got canceled. And so you can see like, like a lot of progress is being made. And then actually Native Americans were at the center of the anti-Vietnam protests. And so I thought this was really interesting and really honorable, because they were not only fighting for their own rights, but also against like the aggression of the US government as a whole, and the government's like brutality to its own people and the people of Vietnam. Because actually many Native Americans who had served in the war found a lot of similarities between American soldiers' treatment of Vietnamese peasants and then past soldiers' treatment of Indians. So I thought that was like,
yeah.
cool. And I don't think that gets mentioned a lot.
Yeah, honestly, we don't talk enough about the Vietnam War either. That should be another episode.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know if I told you, when I actually went to Vietnam and just like spent a day in the museums, and like every American should probably take a trip to Vietnam and just do that too, because the way that we treated them, like a lot of American soldiers, is ridiculous. And it's not just like fighting against soldiers, it's just like innocent civilians and kids, and the way that we came in there.
Yeah, literally just so many innocent lives were lost, and it was really brutal.
Yeah.
We killed and harmed them. And
yeah, honestly, like tortured too. It wasn't even like, the images are really disturbing. Anyways, that's another topic for a later discussion.
I think that's like one of the reasons why we don't talk about it, is because it's really hard to remember. But we have to remember it so we don't repeat that in the future. But yeah, maybe that's something we could talk about in another episode too, because conveniently, and I feel like in all my history classes, we only made it up to World War II. We never got to that era. But anyway, so one of the events during this time to support the movement that caught some of the most media attention was the occupation of Alcatraz Island. So I literally had no idea of this, but Native American activists had actually they went to the island and occupied it for a very significant time. And so the prison had actually closed in 1963. And so after that, Native Americans in San Francisco and the Bay Area started lobbying the government to have it redeveloped as an Indian cultural center and school. But the government basically was like, no, sorry. And
that's also, how do you wouldn't you have to take like a boat every day to get to Alcatraz?
Yeah, I think you would have to take a boat, but I don't know, maybe like water taxis or something.
Okay.
I've never been to Alcatraz. I don't know how far away it is from the shore.
I think you can possibly swim. Not really though.
Well,
like if you're really in shape, you could swim.
No, like there were like prisoners who escaped from Alcatraz, and the whole thing is like,
there's actually only like 3 prisoners who escaped, and that is like a big conspiracy theory because the bodies were never found. But then I don't know, I looked into it for a little bit. They do have like a triathlon called the Escape from Alcatraz, but I don't think you're actually leaving Alcatraz. I think you're on a boat out there and then you swim in.
I see. Okay, yeah, they're not like, here, go, be free. But
Yeah.
so yeah, okay. So in October 1969, a fire burns down San Francisco's American Indian Center. And so these Native Americans are even more adamant, like, hey, now we really don't have anything. Like, can we please build an Native American cultural center on this island? And again, the government says no. And so in November 19th, 1969, a handful of protesters belonging to an activist group known as Indians of All Tribes occupy Alcatraz. And so they're led by Mohawk leader and Professor Richard Oakes. And Richard Oakes, he basically argues that the protesters had the right to occupy the island under a treaty provision that granted the Native Americans unused federal land. And he also said, like, quite sarcastically, that Alcatraz should be an Indian reservation because it was isolated and rocky, it had no running water, and it housed prisoners. So he like he was really serving the tea. Like, he
Yo.
remarks like, oh my gosh, everyone should look up Richard Oakes and all of his interviews, because he like
Oh my gosh. Yikes.
backs. um, and so these protesters only end up staying for one night before they're removed by authorities. And so Oakes, he comes back and he states that if a one-day occupation by white men on Indian land years ago established squatters' rights, then the one-day occupation of Alcatraz should establish Indian rights to the island. So he is like really ruthless, and like I love it. But and so on November 20th, 1969, the Indians of All Tribes activist group, they try one more time to occupy the island. And this time they come with 89 men, women, and children. And so a bunch of people come this time. And they all move into the old warden's house and the guards' quarters. And they address the public and they state their intentions to use the island for an Indian school, cultural center, and museum. And so it's like, it's pretty innocent, innocent request. Like, it's not, they're not really asking for much. And so Richard Nixon is president at the time, and his administration was pretty hesitant at first to forcefully remove the protesters. So the government decides to leave them alone as long as they're peaceful. And there are actually many attempts by the government to settle a compromise with the protesters diplomatically, but the activists are very adamant that they won't settle for anything other than land rights. And so more and more protesters come to the island because this demonstration is gaining so much media attention. And so pretty soon there are actually more than 600 occupants on the island. And so they form a governing council, they create a clinic, a kitchen, public relations department, and even a nursery and a grade school for their children. And so it's like literally like it's their own
Like a town. Yeah, dude, how big is Alcatraz? I did not think it was that big.
I guess they have like the prison itself can hold a lot of people, but I don't think the island, like I don't think there's much free space.
Yeah, I think it's tiny. I'll go sometime and let you know. I don't think it's that big.
No, it does not sound like it's a fun place to live, but they were very passionate about the cause. So, however, by early 1970, many of the island's college students had to return to school, and they ended up leaving the island. And they were actually soon replaced by people who are more worried about living rent-free than the actual cause. And yeah, and so
Wait, but like were they also Native American, or was it people who weren't even Native American who just came?
there were some Native Americans, some non-Native Americans, because it's getting a lot of media attention and people are coming out. And yeah, I think there are some people who are taking advantage of the situation and weren't really there to like fight for the land rights. And
Oh.
yeah, and so unfortunately, drugs and alcohol, although they were originally banned, it becomes a pretty prominent issue on the island as these newcomers join the settlement. And this is really sad, but in January 1970, Oakes's young stepdaughter, she falls to her death from one of the stairwells. And so because of this, Oakes and his wife leave the island soon after. And so this kind of leaves all these different groups to fight over control of the island. And so the federal government sees this, and they decide that there's really no longer much hope for a diplomatic resolution. And so they decide to cut off all the power in an effort to like force the activists out. And they're all these activists are so passionate that they decide to stay. And a few weeks later, a fire breaks out and burns down several buildings. And so this, yeah, it's really sad. And so despite these awful living conditions, and then there's also diminishing outside support because it's, you know, it's going on so long and the media is not paying as much attention to it. So despite all this, there are still a few activists that continue to live on the island for a whole another year. It's like this lasts forever. And so unfortunately, well, okay, yeah. On June 11th, 1971, armed federal marshals descend on the island because they're like, hey, we need to restore the island's foghorn and lighthouse. Like, we waited for over a year, and so sorry, but you guys all have to leave. And so they removed the last of the activists. And so by the end, the remaining protesters included 6 men, 5 women, and 4 children. And so the occupation lasted 19 months, and it basically inspires many other occupations and protests all across the country. And because of this, federal officials begin to listen more to issues regarding Native American self-determination. And later on, the US government would return millions of acres of ancestral Indian land, and they would pass more than 50 legislative proposals supporting tribal self-rule. So there was a lot that came out of this.
Good, yeah.
Yeah. And so the social movement, so the Native American civil rights movement can be seen as one of the most radical social movements of the era, because unlike many other, I guess, more populist causes at the time, the Native American rights movement attacked people's fundamental right to their own property by arguing that American society was built on the theft of Indian land. So it's like, yeah, they're basically, yeah.
See, that's funny that you're like, it's like the more radical, but I was like, no, it makes sense. Like, but yeah, I guess like that is a radical.
It does.
No, I don't. I have a hard time feeling like that's radical.
No, but I guess, yeah, I guess it's not as populist, or I don't know if that's the correct word, but it basically is attacking like every non-Native American.
Oh, so any landowner basically, like you're in. Okay.
But like you see where they're coming from. And
Yeah.
it's also really interesting to note that these Native Americans are protesting against the US government by using their own treaties against it. And this kind of ultimately exposes the government as a dishonest institution. So that's why I think the Native American civil rights movement is really different compared to other social activist movements, because its focus is like mainly legal, and that's kind of how they fight things out, is through the courts. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that is. I think that's also very impressive to me, is like you basically just like, you made this contract.
Yeah.
This is what you said. I think that's really clever. And
Well, and there's so many treaties that had been signed too. So you have to have such a wide knowledge of all these different treaties that had been made like years and years, like hundreds of years ago. And
yeah,
that could be,
well, to be honest, if like you're getting taken advantage of for years and years and years, I'd be reading my treaties too. Like, what did I sign up for?
that's so true. Yeah.
You know how many times I read my lease statement? Like,
Yeah.
I would not be messing around.
No, that's so true. Yeah, you would definitely be way more, I guess, yeah, way more knowledgeable on that.
Right.
And so, yeah, also at this time, we see all these different organizations that are being created, because I guess before this, it was mostly inner tribe activism. And so you kind of mostly worked with your own tribe to fight for your land rights in your area, in your reservation. But then now we see a lot of organizations where we're getting Native American leaders from all across the country to come together and support the movement as a whole. And so one of these organizations is the American Indian Movement, also known as AIM. And so it's founded in 1968 by Russell Means, Dennis Banks, and other Native leaders as a militant political and civil rights organization. And it was actually one of the reasons they decided to create this organization is to stop police harassment of Native Americans in the Minneapolis area, because that had been a really big issue at the time.
Minneapolis, Minnesota?
Yeah,
Huh.
yeah. So I guess that was an issue all the way in the 1960s. So I'll leave it at that. But so now this brings me to, I guess, what I want to talk about for the remainder of the episode, which is the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973, which is one of the more like well-known demonstrations during the Native American civil rights movement. And so Wounded Knee is located in the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And so it's a small town, and it's actually in 1890, it was the site of the massacre of 300 Sioux Native Americans by the 7th Cavalry. And so it holds a lot of historical significance for Native Americans in the area. And in 1973, it's Wounded Knee is home to the Oglala Lakota tribe, and it's one of the poorest communities in the U.S. And it has one of the country's lowest rates of life expectancy, along with the other towns within the Pine Ridge Reservation. And so, like, it's really sad. It's a really poor community. And on top of this, the people in Wounded Knee face racism not only outside of the reservation, but inside their own reservation as well. And this is partly due to a very poorly managed tribal government. And so basically, the people of Wounded Knee really wanted to remove the tribal chairman, Dick Wilson, because they thought he was very corrupt. And so people said he favored mixed race, assimilated Lakota like himself. And so they tried and tried to impeach him, but all their efforts failed. And so the Oglala Lakota tribal leaders, they turned to AIM for help with removing him by force. And so they contact AIM, and AIM's answer is to occupy the town of Wounded Knee. And so in early 1973, AIM begins their preparations for this occupation. And so AIM believes that they needed to use physical force in order to create change in American society. So that's why they choose to arm themselves with guns and other weapons, and they refuse to leave the town. And they also argue that they had to arm themselves because the US government had robbed them of their lands with far worse acts of violence. So that is their mindset going into this occupation. And so on February 27th, 1973, around 200 Sioux Native Americans, led by members of AIM, occupy the town of Wounded Knee. And so they basically, what happens is they arrive in town at night in a caravan of cars and trucks, and they take the town's residents as hostage. And so they declare the town liberated from the US. Then they cite a treaty from 1868 that allowed the town to remain under Lakota control. And so they have this treaty, and they're like, the government, this is one of the many treaties that the government has ignored, and actually this shouldn't be American soil. And within hours, police surround the town of Wounded Knee. And so basically this prevents protesters from leaving and then sympathizers from entering. And so they basically besiege the town. And they order the occupants to disarm themselves, but that does not happen. And so Dick Wilson, the tribal chairman that people were complaining about earlier, he had actually heard about AIM's plans to occupy the town and remove him. And so before this, he retreats to tribal headquarters, where he is under the protection of federal marshals and then Bureau of Indian Affairs police. And so he's like safe and out of the picture, even though that was kind of one of their main reasons for infiltrating or occupying the town. And so the following day, AIM members begin trading gunfire with federal marshals that are surrounding the town. And then they also fire at like automobiles that are driving by, and then low flying planes that, yeah. And so from then on, they would trade fire with federal authorities almost every night. And so I want to ask you, like, how long do you think this siege lasts?
I literally was about to ask you. I was like, how long did that last? Let me think. I was thinking like a week maybe
Okay.
of like ongoing. It's just like them firing back at each other every day.
Yeah. Is that your final answer?
Yeah, but I guess it's wrong. The way you're reacting.
So it actually lasts 71 days.
No. What?
For 2 months. My mind was blown. That is
Every single day.
every single day they're like trading fire with federal authorities. Like I cannot imagine how stressful that living situation could be like. For
Right.
71,
Also, are they like, did anyone get hurt? And also, what was the cost of like always needing to buy like
we'll
weapons?
we'll get into that like after this, but yeah, it lasts for a really long time. And so they're basically trapped in the town though, because the authorities are surrounding the town. So their only way out is like through surrender. And so in order to try and break the siege, the FBI cuts off all electricity and water to the town, and they attempt to prevent food and ammunition from being passed to the occupiers. So this is like literally horrible, horrible living conditions. And so Bill Zimmerman, he's a sympathetic activist and a pilot from Boston. He basically agrees to deliver 2,000 pounds of food and supplies to the town, like via a small little plane. And so he flies to Wounded Knee, and he's like, I don't know the mechanics of it, but he's like dropping dropping the supplies. And sadly, or I guess, however, when the occupiers like run out of the building where they were hiding to grab these supplies, the federal agents open fire on them. And so, yeah, so during this shootout, the first member of the occupation to die, he's a Cherokee man. So he was shot by a bullet that had flown through the wall of a church. And so he's the first person to be
Whoa.
in this occupation. In this,
Question. Okay, I'm just trying to wrap my mind around like physically what this looks like. So they're like surrounding a town
yeah,
basically. And is there like a barricade at all, or it's just like literally like I'm imagining like tanks or something in a big circle around it?
yeah, when I was looking at photos, I like didn't get an aerial. I didn't see any aerial staff photos, but the photos they did, there were tanks and like physical like wood barricades that blocked off the roads.
Uh-huh.
And also you have to like remember it's in South Dakota, so it's like open plains, and so
Uh-huh.
really like there's no trees for people to hide.
Yeah, I'm imagining it's like pretty open. Okay.
Open, so it's just like buildings, so you can't really like you can't run, you can't escape because you're out in the open. And so
Right. And then was this after the 71 days then like, or is this during the 71 days then someone dies?
yeah,
Okay.
this is I think I think it's about like halfway through, maybe closer towards the end, but I didn't get a specific date on the Bill Zimmerman airdrop. I know he actually wrote a book about the pilot wrote a book about this event, and so you can read that. Um, but yeah, so they're trading fire with federal agents every night, and then on April 26th, tribe member Buddy Lamont is shot and killed by agents, and morale drops severely because this has also been going on for so long. And it's really, yeah, it's really awful living situations. And so AIM members, they really want to continue the occupation, but the Oglala, they overrule them. And so after this, negotiations pretty much begin. Like before, there had been negotiators that had been sent from the government to talk to the protesters, but they really had no interest in what they were saying. But then after the second member is killed, then that's when they really, I guess, start putting more effort into the negotiations. And so Russell Means, he was one of the founders of AIM. So he leads the negotiations for the release of the hostages. Because you also have to remember, like, they're taking the people in this town as hostage too. And so Richard Means, he demanded that the U.S. Senate launch an investigation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and all Sioux reservations in South Dakota. And he also wants the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to hold hearings on the several Indian treaties broken by the U.S. government. And so they have very like specific legislative action that they want to be passed.
Okay.
And so
all pertaining to land rights, right?
Yeah, pretty much all pertaining to land rights. And then also there's this Bureau of Indian Affairs, which exists today, and they have a lot of complaints with the Bureau as a whole and the way they deal with Native Americans. And so their AIM also ended up occupying the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in DC later. And so there's a lot of issues with this specific department. And so they want an investigation being held on the department to make sure it's as effective and supportive as possible for Native Americans. And then also land claims and breaking treaties. Like they want these treaties to be reconciled. And so did you?
Yeah, I was gonna ask. So this is the Wounded Knee. It's not the Wounded Knee Massacre, right?
Yeah. So this is Wounded Knee 1973. There is a Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, and that's where basically the U.S. Army kind of they massacre. I think, what did I say? 300
in the 1800s.
Yeah, in 1890. So
wow.
Native Americans are killed. And so that's one of the reasons why they choose Wounded Knee. Maybe not one of the reasons, but it really holds a lot of significance during their protest. Just remembering like all the atrocities that has been committed in this one town. And so on May 8th, 1973, AIM leaders and supporters surrender after officials promise they're going to investigate their complaints. So they're like, okay, we'll meet your demands. And I guess we'll get into that later. But so throughout the duration of the siege, 2 Native Americans were killed and a federal marshal was permanently paralyzed by a bullet wound. And so some AIM members actually managed to escape the town before being arrested. However, there are still like hundreds of arrests that are made. And so Russell Means and Dennis Banks are among the activists that are arrested. But on September 16th, 1973, they go to court, right? And the federal judge actually dismisses the charges against them because the U.S. government had unlawfully handled witnesses and evidence. So it had kind of come out that the FBI had manipulated key witnesses. And so the charges against them are dropped and they're let free. And so remember how when they had started to occupy the land, they said that there was this treaty from 1868 that allowed the Oglala Lakota to claim the land, right? And so the government basically concludes that this treaty was superseded by the principle of eminent domain. And so eminent domain, I remember hearing about it in AP US government, but I had completely forgotten what it means. So just as a refresher for everyone, eminent domain is the power of the government to seize the private property of an individual or group for use by the state if they provide just compensation to property owners. So basically they're like,
oh, okay, I have heard of this, because isn't it that's when the guy, if they want to build a highway, they can take your house.
Yeah, as long as they pay you, then it's fine. And so basically they're like, well, we paid you for this land, and so this treaty is invalid and it's actually American soil still.
Did they get paid for the land though? And what were they compensated with?
I could not find. That's why that was my immediate thought. It's okay, was it actually just compensation? Because I guess maybe a long time ago, when during westward expansion and all that, I guess the land technically was purchased, but I could not find for how.
But what? Because California's expensive, baby. How much did you pay them?
would be very interested to see like how much they paid the tribes for their land.
Mhm.
But basically they're like your whole argument is invalid, and so
Oh
yeah.
my gosh.
Yeah, so people, as you can imagine, people were very devastated.
Yeah.
And in terms of, I guess, other ways this event is remembered, so according to the US Marshal Service, uh, the occupation of Wounded Knee was actually the longest lasting civil disorder in 200 years of history. So I think it's also important to note like, different ways this event is remembered and kind of people's sentiment on what happened.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say I would love if we could like find someone who's like more connected, like maybe Native American, and has like gone through like history and like heard stories from their family. Because I'm curious as to the whole purchase argument that they made. Like, who do they pay? Like, who got the money? Who did they make a deal with? And why does that invalidate like every single other person who's a part of the community?
No, I would really love to talk to someone about that too, because I have so many questions. I'm also like, yeah, who gets the money? Who decides like how much money is being spent? And then also, I guess eminent domain is kind of tricky because like, what is a justification? Like, what qualifies when they use the word like just compensation? Like, what makes it like a reasonable
Right.
price?
Like who gave the appraisal on that? Like how can yeah.
So I would really like to talk to someone about that. I guess I'll. There are a lot of autobiographies that are written about this and these activists, so I'll mention those a bit later. But there is a great PBS documentary special about the occupation in 1973. So you could hear the people who were there during this protest are being interviewed. So
Yeah. I know a few people who do they're like descendants of Native Americans and they do activist work in the Native American community. So maybe we could reach out to them. Or if you're listening to this and you are Native American or you know someone who is Native American who is connected to that history, please email us at howdidwe not know that@gmail.com.
yes, please do, because I would love to hear, I guess, what they would have to say. And yeah, I have so many questions, so please reach out to us. That would be really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I guess to talk a little bit more about what happened after. So, surprise, surprise, Congress took no steps to honor the broken Indian treaties. But actually, in the courts, some tribes would win major settlements from both state and federal governments in cases regarding tribal land claims. So the judicial system is really important, especially when it comes down to land claims. So yeah. And so Dick Wilson, so he is actually not removed from his position. And the Oglala blamed the federal government for failing to remove him because that was like when they were making negotiations, they're like, hey, can you like please get him out of here? And the government, their response is that it would be illegal for them to do so because it would violate laws regarding tribal self-determination, which is true. Some people do argue that that's a bit shady because they had not been so, I guess, respectful of these laws in the past, and so I'll leave that at that. But after the siege ends, basically a civil war between Dick Wilson and a pro-AIM faction of the Oglala Lakota continues on the reservation. But in 1974, Wilson is reelected to the tribal presidency, and he remains in his position. And so, sadly, violence continues on the Pine Ridge Reservation throughout the rest of the 1970s. So this really broke my heart, and it really shocked me. In the 3 years following the standoff, Pine Ridge, where Wounded Knee is located, it would have the highest per capita murder rate in the whole country. And so I had no idea. But this, like, it's, I mean, if you think about population too, like, it's a really small population in terms of, I guess, the US population as a whole. So a series of beatings, shootings, and murders left more than 100 Native Americans dead. And among these incidents, is an incident that occurs in 1975 where a Native man and 2 FBI agents were killed in a shootout between federal agents and AIM members and local residents. And so AIM member Leonard Petlier, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. It's Petlier. But he was found guilty of first-degree murder, and he's sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms.
What? 2 consecutive life terms?
Because
What's the? Go
he,
ahead.
I
I
guess,
killed 2.
yeah.
Well, you're gonna die once. What is the point? Just to spite you, 2 consecutive life terms. That just one can you can't. It's okay.
I think when it comes to like sentencing, it also has to do with like what happens when you are eligible for parole. Like I think the more life terms you have stacked up,
Okay.
so I think that's the significance of it too. But basically, it does not look good for him. And so today, Pine Ridge Reservation is the largest community in what might be the poorest county in the US. So in 2010, the per capita income in Shannon County, South Dakota, where Pine Ridge and Wounded Knee are located, it was lower than any other US county. And this also blew my mind. According to reports, adult unemployment rate on the reservation is somewhere between 70% and 80%. I can't even comprehend that. Like that's 80% of adults are unemployed. So
Like what? How do you live then?
I don't even know that. Like, how do you live? How do you survive? And when like your basic like human needs
Yeah.
being met.
Also, do you know where like most of the reserves are? Like I don't even know where they're located.
A lot of it is like in the plains, the Great Plains. So like South Dakota, Oklahoma, I think like Montana or Wyoming, like that area. But that's not necessarily. That doesn't mean that that's where I guess like so before Europeans came, Native Americans or indigenous people were like everywhere, but then because we have forced removal of Indian groups and the whole Trail of Tears and the Jackson administration, they're all forced to move to
Yeah.
and they're all concentrated there. So
And then a question on when you're talking about that, like a lot of people were murdered and stuff. Why was there so many like shootouts again? What? Because I thought like this land right thing was settled, and
well it like kind of was settled, but I
there's
think
like a continuing like feud.
yeah,
Obviously,
well, yeah, because basically so the treaty, they were like, oh, the US government, like eminent domain supersedes the treaty. And then they said they would launch an investigation, like whether or not that investigation was actually produced the amount of, I guess, research that they had wanted. Maybe it wasn't as satisfactory as people had wanted. And yeah, the tribal chairman, Dick Wilson, had not been removed. So they were still, like, it was resolved, but it really,
not.
yeah, there were issues actually, there was no resolution to the issues. It's kind of like they put a band-aid on the situation. And so, yeah, like AIM, there are so many, like, I guess, demonstrations in different occupations that AIM and other Native American activist groups would hold like throughout the 1960s and 70s. Like it's a whole like rabbit hole. There's so many that happen, and because of this, a lot of these groups choose to arm themselves, and so that's why there are a lot of deaths. And
Okay.
yeah, and yeah, and so actually in 1978, AIM disbands due to the fact that several of its members were imprisoned, but local AIM groups continue to function afterwards. And like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot more demonstrations that are held. And in 1981, one of these groups occupies part of the Black Hills in South Dakota. So this is not just like an isolated event, it occurs many times. And so Russell Means, so he was the founder of AIM, he was leading the negotiations. He continued to advocate for Native American rights at Pine Ridge and elsewhere. And so in 1988, he runs for president under the Libertarian Party. And obviously he doesn't win, but 1992, he begins acting in several films, including Last of the Mohicans, and he was also a guest star on Curb Your Enthusiasm. So he like, I guess, yeah, he supported the movement in Hollywood and in film. And then in 1997, he released an autobiography titled "Where White Men Fear to Tread." I'm trying to find it at the library. I really want to read it. So yeah, I encourage everyone to read it too. You could hear his accounts of why he decided to create AIM and the struggles that he faced growing up, uh, and everything. And so in 2001, he also attempts to run for the governorship of New Mexico, but his candidacy was disallowed because procedure had not been followed. So basically, he doesn't qualify, and so people can't vote for him. And then sadly, he passes away on October 12th, 2012, at the age of 72. And Leonard Petlier, I don't know, the he, he was the one I mentioned earlier. So he actually remains in prison today, although there are continuing efforts to win him pardon. His next scheduled parole hearing is in 2024, and he is currently 75 years old. And so, in terms of how Wounded Knee impacted the movement as a whole, so basically this event sparks a bunch of international sympathy for Native American activism, and it inspires Indigenous people and left-wing activists all across the country. And a lot of people would later remark that the standoff in 1973 closely resembles the actual Wounded Knee massacre of 1890, because people refusing to arm and besieging the town. And some Vietnam veterans who were occupying Wounded Knee, they actually said that the siege felt like war and reminded them of Vietnam, because there's just gunfire daily. And so it was a really traumatic experience for everyone. And I guess I kind of wanted to mention that I guess perhaps more than any other civil rights movement, its work remains unfinished. There's still so much progress that needs to be made in regards to Native American rights. However, I don't want to downplay like the amount of activism that still remains today. There's so many activist groups all across the country, hundreds of groups that are working to, I guess, create positive change and create change. Oh gosh, there are hundreds of groups that are trying to create change in American society. So I just wanted to list off a few of these groups. And so we have the American Indigenous Business Leaders. They're a nonprofit organization designed to support and promote the education and development of future Native American leaders while maintaining and incorporating cultural values. There's also the American Indian Policy Center, and its mission is to provide government leaders, policymakers, and the public with accurate information about the legal and political history of American Indian nations and the contemporary situation for American Indians. We also have the Native American Journalists Association, which serves and empowers Native American journalists through programs and actions designed to enrich journalism and promote Native cultures. And finally, I wanted to, I guess, highlight the Women Empowering Women for Indigenous Nations, which exists to provide Native women with the knowledge, support, and resources necessary to achieve success in their personal and professional lives. And they hold an annual conference that serves as an opportunity for Native women to engage in professional renewal, inspire others, and to network. And so there's so many other organizations that I would love to talk about. I do not have the time, but I encourage people to look into local activist groups, national activist groups. And yeah, I guess that kind of wraps up. It's a very brief and short summary of the Native American civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. There's so many significant events that deserve recognition. So I encourage people to do further research.
Right. I honestly feel like, thank you for sharing firstly, but I honestly feel like this deserves like a few more episodes, because I feel like just the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 How did we not know that? I have never heard of that. And then while you were talking, I like looked it up and I was like, oh, there were two situations like this, which the siege, which you presented on.
Hmm.
But this is like serious stuff. Like that's a big deal. I don't know why they didn't bring that up in history class
Yeah,
during high school. So yeah, I feel like that alone could have been one topic. So I feel like we can definitely bring up more on this in the future.
yeah, I think that's really important. And yeah, I would love to talk about it more. There's so many events throughout history. I think a lot of Native American history is forgotten by most Americans and it isn't taught about in the classroom. And so we need to, you know, I guess encourage people to learn about it on their own and promote
Definitely.
and also make change within the classroom and the education system as well. But
Hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you for presenting.
thank you for listening.